to Asia Society Hong Kong Center. I'm Holly Smith. I coordinate the business and policy programs here. Thank you for being here on this very hot and sticky night, and hopefully the fans will help us a little bit circulate the air. But I am very pleased tonight to have the pleasure of welcoming Anu Bradford, the Henry L. Moses Professor of Law at Columbia Law School. She's here to speak about her new book, Digital Empires, and this is her timely analysis of the competing regimes that are arising to regulate digital technologies in China, the EU, and the US. We have copies of the book in the back if you're interested in buying it. It's a very informative read. And we're also very fortunate to have with us tonight Douglas Arner, Professor Carrie Holdings, Professor in Law at the University of Hong Kong, to guide the discussion. So please join me in welcoming them.
Thanks very much for that, Holly. And I'd just like to say, good idea. Thanks for that, Holly, and thanks very much for the invitation to be here tonight. In particular, I want to offer a welcome to Anu. It's very nice to have you here in Hong Kong, and great to have you actually speaking about the book in so many different places. I think as a start, maybe you can tell us a little bit about, at the core of the book, is this idea of different and competing models. And can you tell us a little bit about the models and how the idea of the models evolved?
Great, so thank you so much, and thank you all for coming. I really look forward to sharing conversation with you. So the book starts from this premise that there is a growing consensus around the world that technology needs to be regulated. But there is no single model, there's no consensus in how we ought to regulate it. So the book argues that there's three primary ways to think about digital regulation. There is the American market-driven model, there is the Chinese state-driven model, and the European, what I call a rights-driven model. So if we think about the US model, and that to me is largely the foundation of the digital economy as we know it today. So it is a vision of the digital transformation that rests on this notion of free speech, the free internet, and incentives to innovate. So the government has a very minimalist role, and in practice the governance function is handed over to the tech companies so that we can really kind of realize this techno-optimist vision for the world. And that is the path in the American view towards greater societal and economic progress. So China, on the other hand, then follows what I call a state-driven model. So the goal of the Chinese government is to make China a technological superpower, but also then to leverage technology as a tool for surveillance and censorship and propaganda in order then to preserve the political power of the states and social stability in the society. So Europe, in my view, is a third empire. Often the public conversation sort of portrays the entire digital world as being this kind of bipolar, the US-China conflict, and the rest of the world would be at the mercy of that conflict and forced to choose between the two leading digital powers. So I argue that Europeans are not forced to, nor willing to choose to align themselves with either the US market-driven model, which they are uncomfortable with, or the Chinese state-driven model, which they also cannot associate with. So in European view, the Chinese model is too oppressive, the American model is too permissive, so there needs to be a third way. And the third way is what I call the rights-driven model. So the idea is that digital transformation needs to be human-centric, and it is really founded on this idea that we protect the fundamental rights of individuals. Europe wants to protect the democratic structures of the society, but also sort of help institute a fairer digital economy. So redistribute the gains away from the tech giants to smaller companies, to the users, to the public at large. So if we are familiar with the kind of social market economy model of Europeans, that's the vision that is also embedded in the European rights-driven model governing the digital economy.
So when you talk about these models, I understand it's a sort of framing or generalization, but wouldn't you say that all three have some of these characteristics in reality in their systems?
Yeah, so absolutely. I think the models are not pure. So even if you think about the Chinese model, there's a lot of market-driven aspects there. So the fortunes of the Chinese tech companies cannot just be traced to Beijing and the state support, but often to Silicon Valley and American venture capital. If you look at the US, initially many of the leading technologies of today were funded by DARPA, the US basically defense department, because it was part of the effort to really bolster US's position during the Cold War, and also then when faced with the economic competition from Japan. And if you think about the US today, the US is in many ways playing Beijing's game and sort of showering the industry with subsidies, resorting to export controls, investment restrictions. We're moving away from the market-driven model in many ways. So it is true that all these models have elements of each, but I think it's still helpful to think about that fundamentally when making those choices. The state does assert itself differently in China than the state does in the United States. The market-driven instincts still, for instance, prevent the state from going all the way in cracking down the tech industry, whereas it was very easy for China when it decided to make the turn and sort of end this laissez-faire regulation and really decide that it is time to then regulate the tech industry. It was able to do it very swiftly. So ultimately, when sort of making these various trade-offs, the fundamental instincts around sort of the role of the markets and individuals and state are different, in my view, in those three models.
Yeah, so I can see this that, from the standpoint of portraying the different approaches in the different societies. But why this idea of empires?
Yeah, so Empires is a big title, so that's why it's a thick book. And my husband said you can't write a thin book and have a title Empire, so it is a big title. But let me defend the characterization of the three jurisdictions as empires. And the title really reflects this idea that none of these regulatory models are confined to the jurisdictions themselves. Instead, each digital empire is proactively exporting its vision and its set of regulations. So what is the way the US is exporting its market-driven model? It's primarily exporting the private power of its companies. So American tech giants have taken over the world, and many of us daily engage with those American tech companies, become dependent on those companies, use their products and services, and thereby are influenced by this techno-libertarian ethos that is shaping the way these products and services are being developed. So if you think about Meta's Facebook, 3 billion users in 160 countries. 90% of search queries around the world are done using the Google search engine. That's a striking figure considering that it doesn't exist in mainland China. So the US private power is really sort of extending the reach of the American digital empire. The Chinese export, what is the way that China uses to extend its reach? And I mainly focus on the exporting of Chinese infrastructure power. So China is building these digital infrastructures, 5G networks, data centers, undersea cables, smart cities, safe cities, the surveillance technologies along the digital Silk Road, which reaches the big parts of Asia, Africa, Latin America, in Europe to some extent as well. So if the US exports its private power, China exports its infrastructure power. What do the Europeans export? They are exporting their regulatory power. So the EU is not often at the forefront of developing these technologies, but it is the leader in regulating the technologies. So we all can name the GDPR probably faster than we can name a European tech company. And that is because the GDPR is affecting much of the world. But it's not just data privacy. If you look at what the EU is doing in the domain of competition law, antitrust, trying to break the concentration in the markets. Now the EU has an AI Act. It's going to be the first in the world that is binding, comprehensive, horizontal, that is likely to also have a global effect. So I've named this, that was my last book called The Brussels Effect, How the European Union Rules the World. So it's really the way that the European regulations become entrenched across the global marketplace. often simply by way of multinational tech companies deciding that it is in their interest to then extend the European regulation across their global production or global conduct because they want to avoid the cost of complying with multiple different regulatory regimes. So let me Douglas, make one comment about this, which is another argument in the book that we often think about the world sort of leading into the kind of splinternet or these separate spheres of influence. But if you recognize that each of the empire is exporting something different, they are contributing a different layer, so to speak, to the digital governance. That suggests that the empires are active in many markets at the same time. There are many countries around the world that have the American tech companies, Chinese infrastructure, and that are affected by European regulations guiding some of that infrastructure and the tech companies. So the empires are also then colliding in many of the other markets because they reach the sphere of influence is overlapping.
Yeah, and I think that's in many ways a really interesting direction, this idea of competition between the three. And how are you seeing the competition developing, particularly in, one would have to say, I guess, fourth markets as opposed to third markets?
So I don't think there is going to be a single winner in the battle of the empire. So sort of one that really, in the minds of all the countries, turns out to be superior. So I think there's a couple of sort of strengths and weaknesses of each model. So yes, if we look at the tremendous wealth that the American market-driven model has generated, it is often associated why the US tech companies are so successful because they have had this favorable environment to innovate. So that alone might then persuade many countries to say that, look, maybe we, for instance, should not really regulate AI because we want to make sure that we can take advantage of those gains. The US itself is now becoming more skeptical, sort of seeing the downsides of the excess of the tech companies and sort of rethinking its techno-libertarian commitments, but has a hard time actually passing regulation, in part because it's happening in the shadow of US-China tech war, and the US doesn't want to take risk that it would take a hit on the innovation of the companies whom it relies on to be responsible also for future of innovation and growth in the US. So there are certain sort of benefits associated with the market-driven model, but the costs are also increasingly obvious. So if you look at the way the American companies have overreached in many ways, that has created a backlash across the global markets. These companies have become too powerful. They exert often more influence than states. It's political influence, economic influence, it is informational, it's cultural, and it's shaping societies in ways that individuals are getting increasingly uncomfortable with. These companies have shown they don't care about the data of our individuals. We are surrounded by rampant disinformation and hate speech online that these platforms are enabling to take place. And now we are quite concerned. We are not only excited about AI revolution, but we also know that when things go wrong, they can go horribly wrong. And then the question is, should we really put these companies in charge? So I would say that there is an increasing push towards greater regulation, which suggests, and it's one of the conclusions of the book, that if there is a winner, it is not the American market-driven model, at least in the ideological battle. So people decreasingly trust the tech companies and are abandoning this idea that free markets are ultimately delivering a freer, better, more prosperous society. So if that is the kind of the benefit, but also the weakness of the American model, then comes the question, what about then the European model? What about the Chinese model? And the rest of the world is quite divided. So European model is doing really well in the democratic world. So there are many countries that are emulating sort of variations of European regulations, looking at that's the kind of the gold standard, and that seems to be capturing this sentiment that digital economy needs guardrails, so let's follow what the Europeans are doing. Probably the downside, the concern that individuals and governments have about the sort of adopting, following the European model is this idea that is it consistent with innovation? Yes, it probably better protects our data, but what about then innovation? And there, I argue that I completely concede that the Europeans have fallen behind and are not innovating at the level the American and Chinese companies are. I don't think digital regulation is the problem. It's not because of GDPR that we don't see these booming tech companies coming out of the EU. There's a bunch of other issues, including the European market is still very fragmented. There's no digital integrated single market, which makes it very hard for tech companies to scale in the EU. The same thing, capital markets are much more shallow, less integrated, less deep than in the United States. So it's harder to fund your innovations. European countries have very punitive bankruptcy laws. It is really fatal to fail. So risk averse and is not what generates most innovations. And probably my favorite sort of distinction that I draw, the US has been tremendously successful in attracting the global talent to the US that are now innovating for the benefit of the Americans. And the Europeans have not managed to do the same. So to me, there are these more foundational reasons that explain the differences in the tech ecosystems. And the reason I mention it here is that I would want to sort of alleviate the concerns that, for instance, Americans have is that if we are adopting a federal privacy law, does it mean that it'll be the end of American innovation? That's not going to unravel the capital markets in the US. That's not going to change the way whether immigrants still prefer coming to the US to innovate. So that's not my main concern about European model. I still have criticism about European models. They have a hard time enforcing it. The Europeans are very good at passing regulations, but enforcement record is quite patchy. The Chinese model. Descriptively, it is doing really well in many parts of the world. So the digital Silk Road is providing for many countries a path to digital development. Chinese infrastructure is pretty good and it's pretty cheap. And many countries say that, look, like you need to provide us an alternative and at the terms that we can afford if you want us to say no to Chinese digital infrastructure. So that's one reason why I think the Europeans and Americans have had a harder time convincing the governments not to follow the Chinese model and Chinese infrastructure. And it's also some of the concerns that Europeans have. For instance, the idea that what about like privacy? Like you expose yourself to surveillance if you build those massive safe cities and smart cities. But there are many other societies where, for instance, public safety is a much more important concern for individuals than their data privacy. And they say, look, this is a concern you Europeans can afford to care about. I don't want to get killed, and I'm okay if there's a camera that assists in law enforcement. And it was the anecdote I like to share that the Americans were trying to persuade the Malaysians for turning down Huawei and basically said, like, you are going to be exposed to surveillance by Beijing if you do this. And Malaysian Prime Minister looks at the US and say, what is there to spy on in Malaysia? So everybody just doesn't have the same deep concerns that the Europeans and Americans have said that really ought to count against the Chinese model. And one thing that I think it's important to highlight, this is not an argument that the Europeans and Americans like to admit, but I think it's a fair thing to mention, is that part of the American model was this belief that it is superior because you cannot have innovation without freedom. That freedom is the one that is conducive to creating most innovations. Well, China has kind of challenged that narrative, and they have managed to innovate without being free. Here, though, Douglas, it may be just worth pausing, given like how topical generative AI is right now, is that if we think about how innovative China has been in some domains of technology, it's leading, for instance, in surveillance technologies, facial recognition, it is now lagging behind the US companies in generative AI. And one reason is that it is hard to build those large language models and develop the kind of algorithms and that goes into building generative AI if you need to make it consistent with the censorship regime. You need to limit the data that can go into training these models. So that may be the test case, whether it would really vindicate the Americans to say that ultimately there will be a limit unless you subscribe to a notion of political freedom. But ultimately, I think it has been harder for some of these reasons that I outlined to sort of reject the Chinese model, because many countries look at it and say, look, I can have economic growth, I can have political control, and that works just great for me.
That, I think, kind of takes us to really the question of how do you see all of this evolving going forward? How is this competition, how could it play out? How is it likely to play out? And, from the standpoint of these different models, how could one think about what might be the best approach going forward?
So the way I think it will evolve is that first of all, these conflicts will continue. The battles will not be sort of won or lost in any immediate future. I think, for instance, unfortunately for the ongoing tech war, I see continuing pressures towards escalation. But also there are sort of elements of restraint, that de-escalation, because the economies are so intertwined. I don't see the US winning the tech war. I don't see China winning the tech war. Both of them are losing in many ways. It's extremely costly to fight. And for neither of them, sort of a digital sovereignty is a genuine option. You cannot fully decouple your economy from the very complicated and expensive supply chain and try to replicate that, for instance, in the domain of semiconductors. So what we probably likely see is this kind of uneasy coexistence, continuing conflict which remains costly but manageable. And I think I use sometimes the term by Mark Leonard, who has a great book called The Age of Unpeace, but I think that's exactly what we are observing in digital economy. Not real peace, but not real war, but the kind of age of unpeace, which basically means that we continue to manage these conflicts. So, but some other things that I'm observing is that given that even the US is now having doubts about the strength of its model, we do see an effort by, or impetus by the US and the EU to try to sort of overcome their differences and align their positions. So we see a closer transatlantic alignment, and the direction is that the US is adjusting closer to the Europeans. And one impetus is that, look, China is a common challenge, and the Europeans and Americans kind of generally agree that their differences are not ideologically substantial, and they might be a more pragmatic way to work that out. So that just means that the world is kind of turning more bipolar, but we have kind of two camps of countries, and we are really gearing up for this battle between sort of techno-democracies of one hand, led by the US, but also EU and other like-minded countries that feel that, look, global cooperation is not going to happen, but at least we are hedging and collaborating with the countries we can trust. And then there's going to be more of a techno-authoritarian camp that is led by China and its like-minded allies. And that sometimes presents countries with more of a stark choice. I don't think it's necessarily helpful for the US, for instance, to present that stark choice, because it's not exactly binary. There's a lot of countries that kind of sit somewhere in the middle. And if the US tries to be very Puritan and absolutist, what does it mean to be a democracy? It could ask that question of itself today, given the many challenges to democracy in the US. It may push many countries towards China. The US is also increasingly protectionist today, and it's much harder to tell the countries to stop trading with China and aligning with China if your own policy is about America first or American workers first, and you are engaged in increasingly techno-nativist policies. But let me maybe sort of say that one of the, where I kind of end the book, what I think is the most fundamental battle for the Americans and the Europeans is that they do, and this is part of the notion of techno-democracies versus techno-autocracies and drawing this kind of ideological, political system-based battle line, is that they are worried about the future of liberal democracy. And ultimately, that's what the European and Americans are fighting for. And I remind them in the book that there's not just one way that you lose that battle over a liberal democracy. It's not just if US and EU lose the battle to China, even though it is possible that China does well and the world does become more state-driven in the Chinese fashion. But liberal democracy is also lost if the US and the EU lose their vertical battle against the tech companies, if they cannot find a way to govern these companies. Because the US has a hard time legislating. We cannot really see anything functional coming out of the Congress. I mentioned earlier that the EU can legislate, but it has a hard time enforcing. China doesn't have a hard time legislating. And when the government puts its mind to it, the Communist Party decides it's time to rein in the tech, it does rein in the tech companies, and the enforcement works. So that observation should force the Americans and the Europeans to think that if they cannot, within their own model and in accordance with their own principles, rein in the tech companies, who are the true digital empires? Is it that it's authoritarians or it is the tech companies?
I think that's a really good point, that when we think about this idea of empires, it can also emerge in the context of the winner-takes-all sort of tech industry competition. One last question before I open it to the audience, and that is something that is really beyond the subject of the book, but is something that is very topical right now. And how does artificial intelligence, AI, come into this story?
So it's really interesting that the book was already in print when the ChatGPT was revealed. And then, I thought, now I have a real test. Does my framework work? Is it actually explaining what is happening? So how are the countries regulating AI, including generative AI? So it turns out the US remains pretty market driven. There's a lot of talk and congressional hearings, but they've had congressional hearings on a bunch of things, on antitrust, on data privacy. But ultimately, what we've seen is this voluntary blueprint that together with the tech companies, the government is having some voluntary guidance, which in principle does not constrain the tech companies. So it is much more of a sort of soft approach, market-driven approach compared to what the Europeans and the Chinese are doing. So the Americans have thus far been most hands-off, and I think it's understandable because it's so focused on the economic gains that are potentially available if its leading tech companies are left to innovate. It's also very conscious of this national security narrative and what AI can do to military competition and to bolster the US capabilities there. So the US has been there is genuine concern and there is talk about some guardrails, but there seems to be right now that we're still doing it in a very market-driven fashion. The Chinese have actually, been pretty heavy-handed, deep synthesis technologies, thinking about recommendation algorithms that are AI-driven. China has basically set rules there. And also for generative AI, that's a new front that in China's regulatory developments, where then China is also showing that political control is being balanced with this idea that yes, we want to encourage AI, we do want to make sure that China can innovate, but for instance, when you train those large language models, you need to make sure that it's still consistent with the political values of the country, that it doesn't start generating the kind of messages that would undermine the censorship regime of the country. So we do see this kind of AI has been sort of helping China with its political goals, but also potentially undermining it. So if you think about all these surveillance technologies, they directly facilitate the surveillance that the government engages in. But at the same time, like I mentioned, generative AI can really undermine the censorship. So it is a challenge that China is tackling with regulation. The Europeans, they are of course on it. So they have been on it for 2 years. So they are the first ones to regulate. It was almost ready to go out, this comprehensive risk-based AI Act regulation. And then generative AI, the ChatGPT came. And then the legislators needed to kind of rush to make sure that it's folded into the regulation, and it is right now. So I would predict that the legislation, which now has been approved by the European Parliament and by the Council, so Council represents the member states, then they are now reconciling their differences in this final phase of legislation, and most likely that legislation will be finalized by the end of this year. So we see the very rights-driven regulatory model, huge focus on sort of fundamental rights, for instance, non-discrimination, fears of mass surveillance, so the idea that right to privacy needs to be preserved in the age of AI. So all those goals and values are very much embedded in the European model, and it is rooted in binding rule of law and subjected to democratic oversight, consistent with the European rights-driven model.
Thank you for that. It's very nice to see when you come up with a framework or model, and then to have a test and to see that it is reflected in new developments, and therefore the predictive value continues to hold. I have lots more questions, and I think particularly in the context of AI. But what I want to do right now is open it up to the audience. for questions and comments for Anu. And if I could just ask you to identify yourself, and maybe we'll take sort of 2 questions or comments at a time. I see a hand right here, and another one over here. The microphone is coming, I think.
That was great. Thank you, Anu. My name's Peter Zing from Transhumanism Australia. We're looking at the intersection of AI and Web3 and the developments globally. It's great coining the digital empire and thinking that there's a potential 4th side, which is the open source and decentralization of these online communities that are coming together, forming a concept called the network state. So I'd love to get your thoughts on how this things like cryptocurrency is tackling something like regulatory arbitrage and potentially challenging the sovereignty of some of these nation states that are trying to enforce these digital empires.
So I think you did you want to take 2 at the same time?
Might as well take that one and then.
Yeah,
well,
so you have one of the crypto experts next to me, so Douglas, you should feel free to chime in. Crypto I don't discuss extensively in the book, but let me sort of take your question as a sort of broader question about the difficulty of regulating these tech companies. That they become almost, take a life of their own. They develop the products kind of more independent almost of these governance frameworks and end up sort of developing them with the idea that it would be very natural to move towards the kind of self-governing models that the US has espoused. But I think I generally don't want to believe that is the only way to go about it. When it comes to crypto, for instance, this US has been very different again than the Chinese have. Chinese have taken a very hard line, as we know. The Europeans have their own crypto regulation there. So that already shows that, yes, even if there are kind of forces that would make it self-sustaining, their own regimes created by these communities, there are certain regulators that have the instinct to step in. But I think there's a broader question that I think your observation invites, which is whether it's even possible really to regulate effectively, and what would an effective governance then look like. And there's, especially if I can take the example from AI, is that probably lawmakers don't really understand crypto, but they also don't understand AI, which is why then there's often this notion that, well, you don't understand it well, so maybe you should not regulate. Let's just see how it evolves at first. And I kind of reject this notion that the lawmakers ought not to be in lead because technology is something complex, something that just works differently. We regulate a lot of complicated things. So our lawmakers don't know how to build planes, but we're quite comfortable that there are airline safety rules, right? They don't know how to develop vaccines or medications, but at the same time, we believe that pharmaceutical industry needs to be regulated. So I don't like to think that technology is somehow special and we should think about it as a different domain of economy whereby the lawmakers ought not to be involved. And the same way with all these technologies, again, if I use AI as an example, it's not just about AI. So the reason why European regulators demand that they have a seat at the table, they say we may not be experts on AI, but these companies are not experts on democracy or fundamental rights, yet this technology fundamentally affects the democratic structures, and the Facebooks of the world are some of the least qualified entities to be put in charge of our fundamental rights or our democracy. So that was kind of an invitation, if you accept, in a broader way to answer the question on sort of the relative role of companies, the relative role of the states, and even if regulation is hard, why I believe that the companies ought not to have the veto power, and there's limits to how much I would let them run with their vision of how these technologies evolve.
Hi, I'm Jill. I'm part of ASHK Global Fellows, and my question is, I come from tech industry, and I still remember when GDPR came, I was at eBay, and now the European climate is a bit different with the geopolitical shift. So my question is, how do you connect this regulatory framework, innovation, and geopolitical shift when security becomes #1 priority also in Europe, and cybersecurity, AI can drive social impact a lot and informational flow? And another one is being here and having observed the connection to Middle East, China, Middle East, a new trend, India coming up. Do you think there is a force, block coming up, or do you think US, Europe, and China is still the ones we see next 5 to 10 years being a bigger players?
So let me take the last question first. So, for instance, India. It's a very good question. Would it need to be like described as a fourth empire? I don't think I could name an Indian model that would not be kind of a rather selective emulation of aspects of the state-driven, if you think about data localization commitments, or then some rights-driven aspects, if you think about many of the GDPR type of requirements that India as a country has adopted. So it almost is like a selectively, strategically refusing to align itself with any given empire, but rather saying we've got the heft to make our choices that serve our economy, and we kind of sampling so that we are looking at what these other empires are doing. So some are more kind of as it is aligning with the empires, but others, especially the bigger players, Brazil, India, we can see them kind of find their way and sort of exploiting their ability to sort of shop around and also sort of say that we may not be fully aligning with you. India is an example. When I talked about techno-democracies, it's a question, is it really? Like, should it qualify as a democracy? Yes, India is a democracy, but there are many policies under Modi, if you think about the sort of which don't really fit with the commitment to rule of law and fundamental rights and the democratic structures. So in that sense, I don't think there's necessarily, if there's a fourth empire, I raise the question, is it the tech companies? So the idea that the tech companies themselves actually are likely, their power is quite sticky. And if I, last week when I read about Elon Musk, that came from his biography, being in a position to make a choice if Ukrainians are engaging in a drone attack as part of their conflict because he controls the Starlink, he controls the networks, and he has the power to turn it off. Elon Musk should not be in charge of one of the most brutal geopolitical conflicts that is going on. So that is the kind of power, the kind of the fourth empire that I most worry about. But of course, you know, this sort of relative influence of empires may be evolving. I sort of recognize the dynamic nature of the model. So it's not that I'm convinced that there will not be a fourth empire, or that the question is whether the US and the EU will merge into a sort of single empire, given that they share many of the values. If you can give me a cue quickly of your first question, that was about when you were working on the GDPR, and then you had the question on different climate. Now we're moving towards the geopolitical climate, and
Because also all these big tech companies have presence in that part of the world, which
yeah,
is under geopolitical threat.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they have become also geopolitical players. So if you look at, I mentioned earlier now that the sort of Russian invasion in Ukraine, and they are managing the information wars about the narratives of what is happening. So they are put into position which I think is just too big for them to handle. They're very, very complicated questions, and that's not initially what I think they set themselves out to do. Yet they find themselves making really tough calls, which are very easy to get wrong and very hard to get right. And I think the entire world is now looking at tech through much more kind of national security driven geopolitical lens. That's why when I mentioned that the US is playing Beijing's game, it is because of the shift towards much more geopolitical, where the sort of environment where the stakes of the conflict are seen through a much more hardline national security lens. So I think it is affecting the government policies. It's pushing the entire world towards more sort of techno-nationalism, techno-protectionism, and sort of implicitly also then bolstering the Chinese state-driven model, because the governments are now much more involved in shaping these markets. Massive subsidies that the US is now giving to the tech industry. It's harder for it to say that why is China subsidizing, because now everybody is subsidizing their digital economies. So I think there are some of those turns, and there are many who are casualties in that. So it is harder for tech companies. They don't like the export restrictions. They don't like the investment restrictions. They want to have their commercial opportunities preserved, yet it's increasingly hard. And then ultimately us as users and consumers, we don't win from the kind of tech war. So there's uncertainty in the marketplace, there are inefficiencies, there are gains that cannot fully be realized. So that also ultimately, it's the war that it's really hard for me to say like who would be a winner in this current situation. Yet you cannot kind of wish the geopolitics away. I think it's going to be present with us for some time still.
And I think that raises a question. From the standpoint of the rest of the world, what kind of lessons can you draw from these experiences for their own approaches to these issues?
Well, in many ways, what you look at the approach is that for instance, the whole techno-protectionist narrative is the idea that if even the EU, it seems to be that you would need to think, what are your strengths, and are you really playing to your strengths? So are you moving this battle to the territory that doesn't serve you well? I think the US could remember, sort of fight not what it fears, but what it actually stands for, and what has been the true success of the American model. And it has not been protectionism. It's like by keeping its market open has worked before for a good reason for the US. So going too far away and sort of letting the geopolitical conflicts and fears and uncertainties lead you can kind of blind you to some of your successes. And I mentioned earlier for the Europeans, the Brussels effect, they superpower, the regulation, how they've been shaping the world. If the EU now converts regulation in the tool for protectionism, guess what world is waiting European companies when they go to the rest of the world and try to do business there? If Europeans say that we are banning foreign companies for acquiring European tech startups, what happens when a European company goes to Brazil? Brazilians say, well, we like our national champions as well, so we are going to ban this transaction. So it's almost like, careful what you wish for, and if you are trying to take a hard line in the age of it, like if you take the empire metaphor seriously, those are going to spill over outside of your borders as well.
We've got some more hands. There's two right there. So.
Since I got the mic. I'm George. I work for the ASHK group. I also teach at ASHK, we just talked. And for full disclosure, until very recently, I worked for Facebook and Meta, in charge of public policy for Great China, Mongolia, and Central Asia for the past 8 years. Yeah. So I come from the dark side, the so-called dark side. Anyway, so in the private sector, there's a joke, about the EU, right? People say the US has Silicon Valley, China has Great Firewall. What does EU have? Regulations. I agree. Tech industry shouldn't be treated differently, like a pharmaceutical, oil, banking. It should be regulated, right? But we should also talk about some sort of more walkable, effective regulations. As you mentioned, a lot. EU is busy with regulations, but sometimes the enforcement, is kind of lagged behind, and that makes people feel like EU is just trying to make a regulation almost for a political statement. And I will also argue for, at least to some degree, there is also a sense of protectionism in EU when the lawmakers in Brussels is trying to, make all kinds of regulations, right? I give you one example. We all had experience, travel to Paris, Berlin. The first thing you open the laptop after you got into any European city, you go to Guardian, you go to Times of London, you need to, British is no longer part of EU, but anyway, my point is you have to accept all the cookies, right, the website. 99% of the consumers will do that. Then it poses question, what's the point to make those requirements? If 99% of consumers already accepted, that. I think I made a point. I'm not saying the EU model is not great, but somehow I think EU is also kind of, arrogant to tell the world that we know how to deal with, those things. And I think, I agree, like innovation, whether innovation is harmed by the regulations or not, that's debatable. But I have to say the regulation does at least, whether it's like 10% to 20%, I don't know, harm innovation because of compliance costs. It's ridiculous. A lot of companies hire more lawyers than engineers to comply with those regulations.
Can I think there were 3 questions embedded, so let me maybe take on this one. So one is the enforcement. I completely agree with you that the enforcement record hasn't been great, but more is coming the tech companies' way. So the EU recognizes that the regulation hasn't been as effective. So it has now armed itself with new tools. You may have heard of Digital Services Act and Digital Markets Act, 2 landmark regulation for up until recently, the EU was basically just fining these companies. 10 billion in fines against Google and no dent in the market position of Google. So now, with the Digital Markets Act, Google needs to do, for instance, the following. So we are worried that you have your Android phone, and it's the default that you are using the search engine. Now the Europeans say that when you turn on your Android phone for the first time, Google needs to show you the choice of all the different search engines or all the different browsers, and you will choose what you want. They can't make it a default anymore. Apple needs to let other app stores within the Apple App Store. So they are now like striking to the heart of the business models, the way these companies are operating. And my favorite, your sort of history at Meta, it would not have been good news for you then, and it's not good news for Meta right now. The EU is banning targeted advertising on minors. So Facebook can no longer, or Instagram, basically use the recommendation algorithms and show the advertising based on what the youth has been using when they've been using those apps. They need to order a chronological feed or an alternative. And it's then harder also, which may trigger the Brussels effect, it's harder for Meta to then justify in the US and the rest of the world that, yeah, we are comfortable continuing to exploit American youth. We just figure out that we no longer exploit the European youth. So these are now, it's kind of a real sort of trying and taking up a gear, and it remains to be seen whether it's effective, but the tactics are changing. And these are much costlier for the tech companies. Your second allegation, I think, which is not like a today necessarily as unfounded, is this techno-protectionism, this idea that the Europeans are protectionist. Initially, I would really say that the Europeans traditionally have not been. So I mentioned 10 billion in fines against Google, several antitrust actions. Who brought the complaint to the Commission asking to go after Google? It was Microsoft, another American company. So in many of these these tech battles, there are US companies on both sides of the dispute. So it is not, it's the US companies fighting a civil war in the European territory because Washington gives them nothing. So in that sense, there's no European search engine they're trying to protect. There is no European Facebook that would be a competitor. So I think there's actually a genuine interest that the Europeans have had on protecting, for instance, user privacy. There's a strong historical reason why Europe cares about it so much. That is how Nazis got to find out who were Jewish. And that's how the Stasi, the German secret police, was watching over the citizens in East Germany. The Europeans know what it means when you don't have privacy, and they care about it deeply. So I think the motivations are deeper than protectionism, but I share your concern that today there is a protectionist element that is sort of creeping into the regulation all around the world. And in the EU, let me mention here, when the UK left, one of the sort of strongest pro-trade, free trade voices left, and it created more space for this Franco-German dirigist industrial policy view to prevail. And that gives me a lot of concern. Again, going back to my concerns that it's not going to serve Europeans well if they choose protectionism. But there was a rich question, but maybe weigh in on those two.
Holly, who is next on the list? Right here. There you go.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Anu. Henrik Naujoks, working with Bain & Company, YGL alum. Thanks for the inspiring thoughts. And also as a European and German, I love to hear something positive about Europe, which is not too often. But two questions. The first question is, do you see a convergence of the European regime and the US regime to the extent that the US will embed some of the regulatory aspects into the regulation? You were very skeptical about that they can get anything done, but would be interesting whether you see any convergence or whether these will be very much distinct. And the second, even if this would happen, would this be a really limiting factor for the upcoming power of you called it then the fourth empire, or the vertical risk for the democracy?
So I think I'm of two minds whether I say that. I think there is a narrative that I can give to you that would make it plausible that we see genuine transatlantic alignment. But I also can tell you why that may not happen. And I think it's harder to predict. So there's a couple of reasons why the US is moving towards the EU, is that the public opinion has shifted. So if you ask the people in various opinion surveys, they no longer trust the tech companies, and they are asking for more regulation. And then the lawmakers are also now looking at regulation very differently and are proposing these bills on both sides of the aisle. So in the US, the Congress, the lawmakers, Republicans and Democrats don't agree on anything except two things, that China is a problem and the big tech is a problem. But big tech that's the second thing they agree on. So there's some chance that some of these bills one day will amount to something. But at the same time, the lobbying is relentless. The elections are expensive to fight. And there is the horizontal battle with China that is really sort of hard to let go of. So there are also the pressures why the US may not, the US's best hope may be in the Brussels effect, just hoping that the Europeans will succeed and actually also regulate to the benefit of the Americans. Another reason why I think we might see alignment is that there is an increasingly shared concern about China. And the Europeans have been less of a hardliners compared to Americans with sanctions against China, which has kind of prevented that their cooperation, for instance, in the Trade and Technology Council, this institutionalist forum where they discuss issues including technology policy. The US kind of wanted to make a little bit more about sort of anti-China, and the Europeans were not quite willing to do that. But then, with China's refusal to condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that alone hardened the European views. That was a really, the kind of issue that sort of shifted the Europeans and pushed them closer to the US. So now there might be the kind of view that, yes, this idea that our China policy is also now a little bit more aligned. Germans are most divided internally on that. That's the thing. Like, if you think about what the Greens think versus what the Chancellor thinks, it is a little bit more difficult. So I seem to have a hard time keeping the two questions in the end. So that was the first one.
The second one, even if they adopt some of that,
Yeah.
is this really limiting divergence?
Yeah, I think it's an uphill battle. These companies are extremely powerful. But I think in many ways, the way I frame it in the book is that the US, instead of saying that the EU is forced to choose between the US and China, it's the US that is being forced to choose whether it fully aligns with the EU, kind of musters also that enforcement power from the US, or whether it will let China win. So in many ways, the idea is that the Europeans and Americans doing it together makes it much harder for the tech to kind of evade that regulatory pressure. So for instance, if you think about when Meta launched its Threads app, which was supposed to be kind of a competitor to X or Twitter, and it looked like for a moment that that could really take off. But they didn't offer it in Europe and say that, look, Europe is just too regulated. We can't do it. So I started getting questions. Is this the end of the Brussels effect? Does it mean that the European regulators are giving in? Is Meta winning? And I think it's still hard. I don't believe that these tech companies can act independently of the governments. They cannot decouple themselves from government regulations. So one thing, yes, it may be that they had a moment they tried to stay out of Europe, but it's very hard for a social media company to forgo access to 450 million wealthy consumers, especially because they can't go to China and pick up those users there. They can go to India, but as long as they rely on advertising revenue, the per user revenue is much higher in Europe, where you have wealthier consumers. So one Indian user is not yet today worth the same for a tech company that relies on advertising than a European user is. And third, and this gets me to your broader question, the more the rest of the world is moving towards the direction that the Europeans are moving, the fewer the opportunities for tech companies to say that, look, I just use the sovereignty I have, which is I don't engage in your market. If Australians do the same thing, Canadians do the same thing, Japanese do the same thing, Koreans do the same thing, and if the Americans do the same thing, it's very hard for these companies to say that, okay, we're just going to carve out all those markets. So yes, the closer alignment would still make it hard, but it would make it a way more possible.
Holly, I think it's up to you. Do you want to take a few more?
Yeah, I think we have time for one or two more.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Daniel McDade. I'm with CityU. I wanted to ask about the increase in cyber power amongst non-state actors and the obscurification this means when they enter a new domain of warfare. How will states be able to get past this and retaliate against them or regulate these actors, and how this changed how they have sovereignty over their people and their cyber economies?
So just to make sure that I understood your question, you ask about the non-state actors as being critical in launching sort of offensive cyber operations and how you can prepare for that?
Not just limited to cyber threats and cyber attacks, but something where you look at like the modern day Silk Road, where they have like large drug selling operations, or any dysregulated sort of far away from that's meant to be anti-government like Bitcoin. How can they retaliate, and will these grow as these technologies become more available to people in the next 20 years?
When the technologies become more available to people, and I mean, in the AI space, the idea is that it's very accessible, and anybody can soon have these technologies and can basically leverage these technologies towards harm and fraud. The same way, I think, with cyber operations, there are many non-state actors that are challenging then the systems and defenses of states. So this is certainly not just a domain where we have the tech companies as the private actors, but we also have private and sort of disaggregated, decentralized actors that are challenging the existing frameworks. So I think that is a genuine challenge. Some countries are even more challenged than the others, and the market-driven model makes the US particularly vulnerable because it has very open networks. It's very easy to penetrate them. And because the government doesn't exercise centralized control, it's very hard for government to kind of shut down and protect its system. It relies on the network of its tech companies that are the ones that first report of, for instance, harmful cyber operations. So in that sense, too, that the US has had to rely on its own tech companies to try to shore up its defenses, the same way that I think that if you have AI in the acts of, for instance, criminals, you need to hope that your tech companies are also the ones that help AI fight, good AI fight bad AI. So I think this is one of the domain that takes us to this partnership of governments and the private actors, because it is a very big challenge to resolve.
Right, but where does that leave its citizens? Because it seems to be that they're left out between these MNCs, these companies, and the states, where they're in a network and the citizens are on their own. They're not being protected by the close alliances between the companies and the state.
So I think the citizens, that's what I tried to explain about the EU's model, being really concerned about empowering the citizens as sort of actors and decision makers and deciding the governance exactly for maximizing the protections of the citizens and not leaving them at the mercy of the state. So giving citizens protections against states' abuse of its powers, but also against the abuse of the powers by private actors.
One more? Okay. Who's got the last one? I would say just, yeah. Yes.
Thank you so much. I'm Barry from CNN. You talk about China's state-driven model, and I'm kind of interested. Whether do you think China will make regulations that potentially strengthen mass surveillance, and how China's going to achieve that? And you also mentioned that generative.
Sorry, just to, the last thing that you said, you think that China is going to make regulations that will
strengthen mass surveillance.
Mass surveillance, yep.
Yeah, and how do you think China's going to achieve that? And you also mentioned that generative AI might also undermine dictatorship in some way, and how does the whole process work? Thank you so much.
Yeah, so I think we have seen an increasing moves towards mass surveillance. The most surveilled cities are still in China, so even though I talked about digital Silk Road and exporting those technologies, you still have the domestic demand that is driving the market the most. So even though surveillance is increasing in other parts of the world, it is certainly still an important domestic market. There's demand that is domestic for those technologies, and there's supply that is domestic because you have some of the leading companies to do this. So if you look at many of the reports, that it suggests that we are moving towards greater and greater surveillance. And there's not necessarily the kind of backlash, because there's partially that the narrative is that there is that safety benefits, there are efficiency benefits, and that may just not be the concern that the Chinese people are embracing to the extent that the Europeans. So the pushback in Europe for these surveillance technologies is much greater, because privacy is just a more central concern. And the avenues for that pushback are obviously available to a different extent. And then the generative AI, I think it remains to be seen how China is navigating this challenge, because whether it actually has had a rather effective firewall, not sort of absolute censorship of online, but compared to many other sort of aspiring state-driven governments embracing the state-driven model, China has done it much more skillfully. It has had the manpower and it has had the technological skills to keep the controls over the information environment. But I think this is just a new and fast-moving technology, and there's a kind of a more obvious trade-off that the more data you use to train these models, the better they perform. But the more you are limiting the data that is permitted to be used, the more you are limiting then the innovation potential, because it really focuses on language as the kind of a input in the system that is a determinant also then of your innovation. So I think it's one of those things that we are all watching, whether they can do it in a way. And ultimately, I think there's many who say that if there's a trade-off, China seems to be making its choice, and it's erring on the side of social stability and sort of the political control, even while it is observing some of the economic costs that are a casualty of that approach. But then you saw that China was also pulling back from that big tech crackdown, that it says basically is still trying to make sure that it limits the damage. It still lets the Chinese companies list in the US to get the access to the foreign capital. So we back to this idea that we see escalation, de-escalation, and these multiple goals that all the models, including China, need to be straddling.
I think on that note, I want to just close with 3 points. The first, a thank you to all of you for your participation and questions. I think there will be an opportunity for those of you who didn't get the opportunity to talk at the reception just after. The second is an encouragement to have a look at the book yourself, and there are some flyers at the entrance, which I think offer a discount for purchases. And the third is really to ask everyone to join me in thanking Professor Anu Bradford for a very interesting talk this evening.
Thank you, Douglas. Thank you, Holly. Thank you for hosting me, and really, truly terrific questions. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, and please join us for drinks in the Lupo Wave Room in this way. And thanks everyone for coming and for the excellent discussion.